Michael Cratt, Managing Director with Avcom. Thanks for joining us on Australia in Space TV.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Wonderful. We last caught up in December, so it's gone very quickly. And this is on the back of an interview we did with Lockheed Martin on their SouthPan project. You're a major partner of that, providing the ground segments. It's a massive project, over $1 billion project.
Oh, yeah, it's very exciting.
Very much so. So introduce us to Avcom, I think. You're the managing director, and it's a fascinating business story as well as a space industry story as well.
Sure. So Av-Comm Space and Defence, we specialise in the design, manufacture and installation of RF and optical ground segment. So what that means is we basically build all of the infrastructure on the ground that supports satellites in orbit for a very wide variety of applications.
But your main focus is on the ground segment, and I've got one up where you've got the Cassowary. That's right, the Cassowary ground station.
Yeah, the Cassowary. That's our Australian-made antenna system that we've been putting together for about a year now. That's quite an exciting project that we're working on. Hope to deploy out to a few more sites this year. We've got a couple of customers locked in already, and that's just the ground station itself. But when we talk about the ground segment, our role kind of extends out to things like doing the planning approvals, the frequency allocations, the building data centers, running power, concrete, a whole stack of different subsystems that we pull together and call collectively the ground segment. And then often the signature piece is the ground station itself, so that the satellite antenna or whatever that antenna system might look like.
There's been a lot of development in the ground station and the way that they're designed, their sizes, and the like. And even having a look at the Cassowary, it looks like a nice, tight, small, compact piece of kit. Is that where a lot of the development has come from the company itself in terms of your R&D?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of genesis. I mean, in the last 5 years or so, we've seen the proliferation of non-geostationary satellites. So that's satellites in mid-Earth orbit and low Earth orbit. And those satellites really need a different type of antenna system to work well with them. The traditional satellite antennas use what we call an elevation over azimuth style mount. And basically, in geosynchronous orbit, the antennas don't really need to track except perhaps when they're very large aperture. But all these smaller satellites in lower orbits, we need to track them. They're often in different orbital planes, each pass they come over. And so you need to have an antenna system that can track. And what we use is what we call X over Y geometry. Essentially, that just means that we can track 100% of the pass when the satellite comes over top.
Nice. I mean, given the background to Avcom and what you're currently doing, as you say, sort of low Earth and MEO satellite tracking, maybe tell us the background to Avcom, because these have been manufactured in Australia as well. That's another absolute benefit here.
Yeah, so it's a family business. My father, Gary, started the business back in 1981. Right. So this is our 42nd year in the ground segment. And essentially, we've been building ground infrastructure as long as there's been satellites over our part of the world. My father got into it through a hobby, and the business has kind of grown along in leaps and bounds, although quite a lot in the last kind of 10 years.
41 years of leaps and bounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've seen a lot of different technology changes. Different trends have come and gone. And now I think we're just kind of in the right place at the right time with the right skills and experience. And the business itself is really growing away nicely.
Well, I spoke to your dad at the Christmas function in December for Avcom. So that goes back to the Dick Smith days for us older folk would remember that. So it's really gone through. What are some of the sort of key milestones for the business over 40 years? It's a great story for any business owner and operator. But yeah, when you look back for 40 years and you've spoken to your dad, what are those sort of key milestones, I suppose, is what are the highlights for the company that changed it?
I guess we've seen a few different trends come and go. In the late 90s, early 2000s, the reception of television via satellite was quite big. This is before Foxtel came around. So we used to sell C-band antennas so that you could receive all sorts of international television from around the world. Then that kind of phased out slowly. It's still being used, but then we had internet delivered by satellite, so broadband satellites kind of in the in the 2000s and still carrying over till today. And so that saw what we call VSAT antennas being installed on people's houses in remote areas, allowing them to connect internet where previously they had no infrastructure to do so. And now we see, the trends towards satellites in non-geostationary orbits, whether that be a OneWeb, a Starlink, and those kind of innovative new satellite constellations being used to deliver internet, and so many more services delivered over that internet connection for downstream benefits. In the early days, it was things like banking, emails, web browsing, and now you're looking at kind of streaming, online gaming, things like this are now enabled through the new constellations.
Just following on that trend from looking back, now looking forward, what are those sort of key trends, particularly say in bandwidth, that you're seeing over the next sort of 5 to 10 years potentially?
Yeah, so in the past, we used to have satellites that had what we call a wide beam. So they might have a global beam that could cover essentially a third of the Earth's surface. And basically, every new satellite generation, the beams are getting smaller and there's a lot more beams to require it. That allows those satellite operators to have a much higher amount of bandwidth to kind of on-sell. But what it means on the ground segment, and importantly for us, is that they need a lot more antenna systems to support those. So in the past, you might have had one teleportal gateway in one location with many large antennas. These days, it's increasingly moving away from that and decentralizing. Ground stations for Starlinks and OneWeb constellations are being built in data centers and telephone exchanges that are not built in these traditional teleport type facilities. And they need many more antennas. So where you might have been able to use one or two antennas, now you need hundreds. So to be in the ground segment now, there's just so much more going on. Every satellite that gets launched, and we all know how many more satellites are being launched in the last couple of years than previously, they all need a ground segment or 10 to provide coverage. So it's a great time to be in the ground segment.
We were just on the back of a conference last week, and the numbers are up to 10,000 new satellites to be launched over the next for this decade alone. So you're really right in the middle of it. And given Australia the size, is this where contracts like SouthPan are going to come into play for you as this technology continues to develop and we become more reliant on satellites?
Yeah, I think we've always been quite reliant on satellites, but
True.
they're not a very visible thing, and so people often don't associate maybe the products that the satellites deliver. So whether that be GPS navigation, weather information, things like that. What's great about SouthPan is really that Lockheed Martin facility in regional New South Wales. From a frequency perspective, they have access to a lot of spectrum, and spectrum is one of the challenges for this kind of decentralization we're seeing in the ground segment. So we have smaller ground stations in more places. A lot of the time, the restriction is now whether we can get access to the spectrum we need, or perhaps protection in the spectrum we need. There's a couple of great facilities around Australia. So there's a couple of great sites out in Minganoo where they have already got ACMA protection, and that's the regulatory body that governs these.
ACMA,
yeah. But then on the east coast of Australia, the Lockheed site is really the best place you can do it. So from that site, you can do a lot of exciting things.
What are some of the key challenges for the ground segment, but for ground stations, things like physical security, access, those kind of things? What are some of the key challenges that you would need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so the number one challenge I touched on earlier was access to the spectrum that we need. The technology is evolving faster than the regulatory systems are keeping up with.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, it's the terrestrial infrastructure that enables the ground segment. So, all of these different technologies are complementary, and so ground stations need to interconnect with fiber to deliver that data downstream. We need to interconnect with reliable power systems, and so finding sites where you can kind of get those three things to line up, and of course where your satellites need to orbit over the top of, can be a real challenge. You might get 2 or 3 of the 4, but not quite get the rest of the way. So.
And what does it mean if you only get 2 or 3 of the 4? Does it mean it can't go ahead or adds to cost? What's the implications?
Yeah, well, it depends on your constellation. Certainly some of the government defence side of things, that probably means it doesn't go ahead. But in the commercial side, you have to make the trade-off, and most likely, if you can't get access to the spectrum, essentially you can't you can't do that.
That's
But the
the
rest
main
of it
one.
just adds to the cost, and so then it becomes a business case. Does that business case close, and will the project go ahead? Australia's, although, got some fantastic assets, and that's why we're seeing so many ground segment systems being rolled out here to support a whole stack of different constellations.
And regards to power, can you run it on a solar power? Is there, what's the power usage of a ground station?
No, the power usage is generally fairly high.
All right.
It's not so much the antenna system itself, but it's the electronics and the amplifiers that run from the back.
Got it.
We don't need crazy amounts of power, but essentially it's beyond what realistic solar can deliver.
Right. So you do need
user terminals. We can definitely look at using solar power, and we do that where we work in the Pacific Islands because they have far greater power challenges.
Yeah.
But for the bigger gateways, you need reliable connection to the grid.
Got it. So we're still talking mainly regional centres and the like in Australia. You're not going to be out absolutely remote.
Yeah, mainly absolutely regional centres. You're talking about places like Dubbo, Toowoomba, Merredin. These are kind of secondary sites that are setting up. We've got some bigger station facilities in Sydney at Oxford Falls, Perth and Angara, but these sites are becoming kind of surrounded by suburbia.
Yeah.
The demand for things like 5G is very high there, and so the frequency spectrum is often reallocated to other users.
Great.
Slowly closes you out.
Exactly right. Well, and then I think there's a lot of moving parts in all of this for you to consider, and hence why I think, given the background and the strength you've got in the in this area, you're really in a commanding position. What's your sort of call to action and outlook, your roadmap? Just managing this as you go through this growth trend, is it that predictable for you that you can start to plan, or do you find it's still quite a dynamic area?
It's definitely about planning. It's always about how far do you plan forward, how much confidence do you have on the forecasts, and so we're fairly conservative nature. My father's kind of passed that down to me, and so you often want to take a step, but you don't want to take that step too far, even though you look at everything and it's all looking very strong and positive. It's always a challenge. You don't want to you don't want to bet the farm all the time. So one of the challenges there.
Well, you made an acquisition in December, RG, as well. Again, was that how do you want to describe that one? Strategic or timely? Is it part of a growth strategy that you have?
It's part of a long-term growth strategy. We've made a couple of acquisitions in the past couple of years. So in the end of 2019, we acquired a business called Step Electronics, and that's really our satellite communications hardware business. And then most recently, we acquired RG Systems, and that was really strategic and just a lot of synergies basically through that acquisition. I mean, that business focuses on building large ground stations, and particularly with experience in the defence sector. So with a lot of defence programs kind of on the horizon in Australia and abroad, that gives us some pedigree, some heritage there that we're able to leverage into those programs.
Great. So it's avcom.com.au. What's your call to action, Michael, if people want to find out more or potentially get in touch? You're obviously focused here in Australia, but you mentioned the Pacific Islands. Are you looking elsewhere with these products?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have Avcom set up in New Zealand. We actually also have Avcom set up in the Solomon Islands. So our remit in the region is getting increasingly bigger, and we're always looking for good people, clever ideas. Yeah, so if you want to get in touch with us, reach out to us on LinkedIn or our website, or if you'd be down at Avalon, we'll be on the Investment New South Wales stand with the pod. Come and say hello and have a chat with us.
Well, I take it that's part of what you'll be doing throughout the year, is these trade shows. We're Avalon Media partners, so we'll definitely see you next week down there. But what about regionally as well, Michael? Are you looking, Australia, New Zealand and Solomon Islands, sounds like you got Oceania. Are you looking into Southeast Asia?
We haven't quite looked at Southeast Asia yet, although interestingly, we've got our first project coming up in Europe next month.
Right.
So that's quite an exciting thing. So really, we're being taken where the market takes us. So we're not sure exactly where we'll go next, but no doubt it'll be somewhere exciting.
Wonderful. Well, look, like I said, it's a great story. Hopefully, we'll have your dad on at one stage as well. He's a fascinating man, and you've got a great mentor there as well from a business perspective. So Keep up the great work. We're definitely one to watch from a company in the space industry perspective, and you're doing Australia in Space proud. So thank you very much for joining us on Australia in Space TV.
Thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate it. Great to be here.
Wonderful.